Well, good morning. Well, good morning. Thank you so much. Um, I want to welcome everyone and express my own appreciation to the organizers of the symposium. I want to particularly thank Liza both for her work and for her opening comments and for sharing with us in that way. I'm Ian Weinstein. I'm a faculty member here at Fordham Law School. I teach and supervise in our clinic. I teach criminal law and other related subjects. Um, I am really a sojourner in your lands. I've done work for a very long time, as you know, that brings me adjacent to restorative justice. I am grateful for this opportunity to be here with all of you. I regard you and particularly our panelists as, as people of distinctive courage, willing and able uh, to uh, uh, to look harm in the eye and to wrestle with it. I admire it greatly. And I'm so pleased to be the moderator of this panel and to introduce to you four people whose work so reflects the tremendous mix of theory and practice, the integration of the cognitive realm and the affective realm. But let me not go on in this way. Let me say a word about each of them, and then let's hear from them because they are just so terrific. So in the order in which they're going to kick this off, first I'm going to introduce Susan Abraham, who's a professor of law and director of the Restorative Justice Project at New York Law School, a lawyer of deep experience and educator about restorative justice. She'll start us off. Then we're going to hear from Jonathan Scherer of the University of Wisconsin Law School, where he's a clinical associate professor of law and director of the Restorative Justice Project of the Remington Center. Like me, he's a clinician. He's out there doing the work with students, and of course, he's thought quite deeply about it. Then we're going to hear from Logan Seacrest. Logan is resident fellow for criminal justice and civil liberties at R Street. He has a background as a policy and research analyst for the Nebraska legislature and Supreme Court. And he too thinks and practices these ideas, that intersection that is one, I think, distinctive aspect of this work. Then we're going to hear from Talia Gonzalez. She's a professor of law and the Harry and Lillington Hastings Research Chair at University of California Law at San Francisco. I'll just say that she's written extensively on restorative justice, health justice, critical race theory. I've read just a little bit of the work, but it is so smart and so integrative and addresses such important issues. And it's just such a terrific panel. So let's turn first to you, Professor Abraham. And you know what I'm going to ask you because we talked about this. Um, uh, what do you want to say to this terrific audience of both students and restorative justice practitioners, theoreticians? What is restorative justice? What should we be thinking about as we begin this terrific symposium?
Thank you so much. And I just want to first acknowledge that that story, that personal story that was shared so bravely and courageously and open-heartedly by Eliza is kind of the heart of restorative justice. And I just want to say we're all grateful for that, because as attorneys, as a law professor, as a practicing lawyer, we're so trained not to reveal personal experiences and feelings. And the heart of restorative justice, as Professor Bader's story showed, and as Eliza's story showed, is that we have to think about people as humans and see each other and listen to each other's voices, which our systems don't allow us to do. And I think both stories were like, well, I did my job. I looked at the evidence from the prosecutor's point of view, but I felt like there was this human being here. And as the judge said, the system doesn't allow us to actually react and as we would as human beings. And I think, Eliza, your story also revealed something similar. And then what's the next step? So I would say the heart of restorative justice is for people to repair relationships, listen actively to each other, and to recognize that justice is based on healing and individual to each person's needs. And it's a set of values as well as a set of practices that requires a real paradigm shift in the way we think about justice, which is baked in that it has to do with punishment. And I think we really have to challenge a lot of preconceptions that we don't even know we have to start thinking about what is restorative justice.
Thanks so much. I'll turn to you, Professor Scher, next, and I do have to say, um, uh, uh, I so admire that you're out there doing this work of such important transformative work, and then you're doing the work with law students. My friends in the audience know that for me, that's about the highest compliment there is. So, what's your take on what you want to say to this audience to start with the symposium? What should we be thinking about? What is restorative justice about?
I mean, the first thing I would say is that everything I would have to say matters way less than the comments that we heard from the experience in looking for justice, right? So that is really the direct work that I do, is working in those sorts of high-level violent cases, homicides, sexual harm cases, and offering that that sort of process that was desired in this space. And really put me into this space of thinking about all the clients that I currently have, all the clients that I've worked with, that's a story that I've heard hundreds of times. And so that sort of made me throw everything out the window of what I wanted to say this morning, and really acknowledging that, and in being in that space and thinking about how do we center this in people, centering this in those who've experienced harm, centering this in individuals' experience, recognizing the ways in which our traditional legal systems are about separation and isolation of individuals that don't meet needs. And the ways in which we can implement and utilize restorative justice and restorative processes to help a lot of times clean up the mess that I find in the aftermath of our criminal legal systems. And so thinking about a structure that centers individuals' humanity, that looks at their needs, that allows them to be experts of their own experience and experts of what they need. When we think about restorative justice, in some ways it is about a transition of power. It's a transition from power over to power to, right? Giving power and agency to individuals who have experienced harm and have to go home after a verdict is rendered, right? After that hammer or gavel swings down, and you may have a judge that says, you know what, I hope this brings you closure, or that's sort of the end, right? Well, that's just the beginning of the rest of people's lives. And so centering all of our thought in the deeply personal experiences that people have had and the way they've experienced harm on both sides of this space. So thinking about the pillars of restorative justice, thinking about the ways in which it is an approach towards repairing harm or responding to harm and conflict in a way that meets people's needs, rather than structured solely around whether it's criminal codes or thinking about this idea of only the rule of law, and ignoring the fact that what we're talking about is people, and that everyone comes into this space with their own stories, their own experiences. And for restorative justice, it is even in our space of expert knowledge, taking a step back, walking with people through that experience, and helping them seek what justice may look like for them in all the messiness of what that can mean. I've never had a client come to me, whether in practice, prior to sort of moving into the clinical realm, or in the clinic, no one shows up as a set of well-settled facts, right? Everything is incredibly gray, and we're here to deal with the messiness of human existence and life. And that means there's certain things that we got to set aside in those spaces to think, how do we best walk alongside individuals as we seek a deeper sense of justice, as we look to enhance people's experiences in our systems, and also look to remove as many people from those systems as possible.
Thanks so much. And I'll just reflect back both to Professor Abraham and Professor Shera. I hear themes about seeing people whole, about really critically examining the practices that we see all around us that we just know aren't right. And looking into ourselves to think about what role we can play in change. Is there anything you want to object to so far? How are we doing? Then let's turn now to Logan Seacrest. I already described his background. What's your intervention in this conversation?
Right,
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
I know I was given 5 minutes for this opening, and it's not really enough time to really cover, what is restorative justice. It's such a complex and multifaceted topic. I guess I would kind of define it as human-centered justice, rather than state-centered justice, which is what I think we currently have, which is why I was so glad that Elizabeth opened the way she did. I compared to my distinguished panelists up here, I'm relatively new to the RJ space. I've only been kind of studying it the past few years. And I have to admit, when I first started, I was pretty skeptical. It kind of sounded to me as kind of just like soft on crime. What is this hippie nonsense? Restorative what? But the more I've studied it, the more I think it really really works with some of the kind of conservative principles that we like to focus on at R Street. Public safety, limited government, personal accountability, fiscal responsibility. RJ aligns with all of these principles, and I've been kind of obsessed with it ever since, pretty much. I'm not to the point where I'm stopping people on the street to talk about it yet, but I think my wife is probably getting pretty sick of hearing about it. So why am I up here? Why am I qualified to talk about this? So first of all, I'm from Nebraska, so I probably bring a slightly different perspective than a lot of people to the topic. And for the past 15 years, I've worked closely with policymakers across the country, kind of bringing them on board with things that they might initially be a little skeptical of, kind of like I was. I'll just tell you a really quick story. It's funny. Back when I was at the legislature, I remember citing a Fordham Urban Law Review article, actually, in some of my restorative justice research. And the state senator who had made the request emailed me back, and he thanked me, and he was like, "Oh, the research is great, it's awesome, the work's good, but we need a new citation." I was like, that's odd. What's the matter? Fordham Law, it's one of the best law schools in the country. It's extremely prestigious. The senator was like, "That's true. Might be the case, but it's located in New York City. They're obviously a bunch of liberals. Can't have that." Kind of reminded me. I don't know if anyone is old enough to remember those Pace salsa ads from the '90s, where all the cowboys are sitting around the campfire and they bust out the salsa, and one of them looks at the label and they're kind of like, "This is made in New York City." New York City. Like it's kind of the policy equivalent of that almost. It's so that's kind of the realm ideal, and those are the kind of the folks I'm usually talking to. to just kind of give you an idea of the kind of the viewpoint of the people that we're trying to bring on board here, because I think a lot of times in RJ circles we're just kind of preaching to the choir. So we at R Street kind of like to get outside of that and try to bring other people on board. And yeah, so thank you so much for having me here today.
Thank you so much. Come on, folks, at this moment, isn't it a delight to hear someone suggest that we're all humans in this together, right? That we all experience harm, that we all live in the same fallen world, if I may. Thanks so much. We're going to hear now to bring us home in this initial round, Professor Talia Gonzalez, who I described before. Just I've only spoken with her, had the opportunity to speak with her for 2 small snatches. I've already learned a tremendous amount. So what do you want to share with us now?
Well, first, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here and see folks, right, in the context of which we're gathering. Certainly the idea of reimagining justice is both a provocation, but also perhaps a time where we're feeling that that might not be possible. So sort of recognizing that we're holding both of those things in this moment. I think probably rather than enter into the conversation as a sort of RJ 101, recognizing you're all here for a reason, right? You're all coming with your own expertise. I think maybe I want to knit across some of the things that we heard, even beginning with Dean Landau, to maybe help us move forward in our conversation and more importantly, our day, right? Which is to say, I would underscore the word dynamicism, right? To the extent that, you know, how things can be dynamic and shifting, then become responsive to how do we query the possibility of decentering retribution. I have to say that's where, you know, you're going to hear me perhaps speak more from the lens of a critical race theorist or a woman with intersectional identities, and places where I have felt that like deep marginalization is that I'm not convinced that we are in both a political moment or another moment in which we're willing to decenter, or more importantly, let go of retribution. You know, Project 2025 named Restorative Justice. We see a decrease in funding of K through 12 schools, coming back to Professor Bader, and the fact that we've had such a deep, right, and rich history with RJ relative to schools since the 1990s, and we may not have that possibility. So I think we've got this really interesting moment of opportunity, and not just reimagining, but also holding close to what it is to have dignity and respect for all people, and know that part of our resistance and restorative justice is emancipatory, right? Is a political act, right? To speak your truth is a deeply radical and political moment, right? And to have the space to do that when you might not otherwise have ever had that is so key. And so I think that goes back to Professor Bader's point and even Eliza's point about what are structural limits, right? So if we are, and I teach in a law school, right? So I have a deep sensibility of that. I teach restorative justice to law students, in addition to other work, to say that if our structural limits are X, right, then maybe the question isn't about, is restorative justice compatible with our current system, right? Maybe it isn't, is there a big C R or a little c r? It's, why are we attached to a big C carcerality? Right? Why are we attached to a little c carcerality? And why does that flow across all of these capillaries that land on the bodies of people who do not carry with them a white privilege? Right? I mean, at the end of the day, we have to be sort of querying that. And so I really appreciate, right, Logan's entry into this work with R Street and being able to speak across the aisle, because that's, of course, necessary. But it's also, I think, to make sure that we don't lose in this moment sort of the core of what restorative justice can and also speaks to really importantly. And I think that's where Susan started us, right? This idea that if we centralize harm and we challenge preconceptions, it's also asking us to use practices, values, right, in combination, to Jonathan's point, to ask about systemic harm and structural violence. So it's not just individualized, it's also collective, right? So that Liza has that moment where she regains her humanity, her family can sit in a place that is fundamentally different than where they were 20 years ago. Although you made me feel very old when you said that. Because then I did the math based on how old you were when this happened. And I was like, oh, I started doing RJ in 2001. Wow. But it's not just that. It's the how can we do something that is also transformative, right? Which again comes back to Dean Landau's question, this dynamicism, these moving parts, to Professor Bader's point, right? And so how might we contemplate those possibilities? And I think that's what we're all here to ask, right? So the questions may turn to, well, how do we operationalize this, right? On the ground, I'm working in an office where I have the opportunity for the people that I work with, clients or otherwise, to engage in a different way of relating to each other and them finally being seen, and me too, being seen in that context of having dignity and worth. But it also might mean, to Jonathan's point, of shifting the power over to not just the power to, but the power with, and having a collective responsibility to moving forward in a different way. And so I think that's what a conversation to reimagine restorative justice does. So back to Professor, but maybe there is a big umbrella, right? Maybe there is a big R, right? A restorative, a reparative, maybe a transformative, right? Whatever you want to put to it. But I think it has to be attached to how do we contemplate justice, and that is both individualized and collective, and as theory and as practice, as the messy middle of humans, we have the possibilities to see that in all of these structural, systemic, very practical clinical ways, but we also have the opportunity to do that from a much more transformative context.
Thank you for those really terrific, inspiring remarks. I guess I'm just going to reflect back. For me, I heard the observation that it's the dynamism, it's perhaps it's the critical lens, it's the unsettling nature that's of the questions RJ asks, the processes it encourages people to engage in. That's a central feature, and that opens up the possibility of real change. Because now I'm just going to say, real change probably doesn't come from feeling settled and certain and knowing that you have 3 principles there spelled out and that's what it is. So I want to turn now to that dynamic intersection of theory and practice, and ask each of you to share experiences with the work, with the application, with where these ideas meet practice. And because I expect it's going to illuminate a lot of this. So who wants to begin? It's a little unsettling to them that I'm giving them the choice because I've been very dictatorial, but let's see if this will work.
I'm fine starting if we want to go back to the same old order. Need to be boring, but
oh, come on, Susan. What does any professor say when there's a volunteer? My word.
yeah. So thinking about practice, what does reimagining restorative justice look like? I'm going to leave out those words, enforcement, because I don't really think that is part of restorative justice. But I'm just going to talk about my experience as a teacher of law students of restorative justice. And I want to say first that just in case, I know there are some people who are very, very new to restorative justice, and people who think that it's like a new program that could be like diversion or something like that within our system. And it's not what it is. So in terms of reimagining it, it's really, to me, it's the experience of understanding that our misconceptions and our beliefs about dehumanizing others need to be challenged. And that it's really easy to accept the system as it is if we think bad people go to prison and we don't know who they are. And I think it's inherent in the system we have, if you're a prosecutor and to some degree a defense attorney or a judge, to not see people as human beings, or you wouldn't be able to do the work. That we dehumanize as part of like our professionalism, and we dehumanize ourselves as part of professionalism, and we interact in that way. And so I think my experience is that we all need to be vulnerable and interact in a restorative way and have difficult conversations with people we think we don't understand as a first step to being able to actually think about how can we get to a place somehow of addressing people restoratively, whether it's, in the short term, I can hardly imagine a real restorative program within a system, a criminal system, although I welcome short-term attempts that help people avoid incarceration. I think we have short-term and then long-term real restorative goals. And one thing I just want to sort of emphasize, I see 95% of our criminal cases in New York and across the country are resolved by guilty pleas. And yet our system makes no attempt to support or encourage people to take accountability. In fact, they don't even let someone look at someone's face who they harmed. They don't let somebody interact and see the other person as a human being. The whole goal is, as Professor Bader said, shush, don't apologize, don't talk. Your lawyers will speak for you. That's a system that doesn't allow accountability, basically. And I know people who are serving sentences in prison who themselves have come to wanting to take accountability after years of being, subjected to violence and harm, and the reaction and shame and humiliation and fear, because that's what prison is. And those are all things that make people get defensive, get numb, blame others, blame the judge, blame their parents. That's not the way we encourage accountability and change. And so restorative justice is a way that we can invest in people's willingness to take accountability, to try to make it as right as possible if they want to, if they are willing to. And I just want to say here, it's obviously not for every case. And when people deny guilt, they should go to trial. And that's what all of our rights are for. That's what our whole system is geared for, is trials. And yet that's not what our system is. So we're in a mismatch of, all of these constitutional rights. And then when you have someone who wants to say, I made a mistake, I want to make it right, we don't let them. We say, shush. And so in my class, what I see is the shift. It takes students about a month or two to even be able to absorb the ideas of a restorative approach, because it's so baked into our thinking that justice requires an adversarial system and prison or punishment that people don't even believe that it's possible that people could want anything else. And that's what prosecutors often say. We have to get jail time because that's what victims want. But no one has told people that there are other approaches. And I think the most important thing we can do now is engage in restorative conversations and practices with people we've had conflicts with or different experiences with, and have to interact and reassess our own assumptions and listen actively. Because I see just among law students who are trained already so far in not asking the questions like, well, what's prison really like? And in a criminal law class. And of course, the teacher is going to say, that's not what we're learning about here. We've got a, statutory interpretation or maximums and minimums. That it takes so long for students to even think we're allowed to talk about fairness and how the system perpetuates harm. It actually causes more harm. And to rethink what our goals are, community safety, that how it can be aligned with humanity, empathy, compassion, and accountability, instead of, being told that those things are at odds. And I think the more we do restorative justice with kids in schools and have them learn how to deal with, somebody's bullied in a restorative circle in the classroom, and find out that the perpetrator often has been harmed too.
Thanks so much, Susan. For me, the observation that we can't reach for a future that we can't imagine, right? The law is a deeply traditional institution, and we have work to do to reimagine.
So Jonathan and I are friends, and I whispered to him that I'm going to sneak in front of him. And so we're taking your request that we lean into places. So I think I want to get actually really granular, right? Which is to say, Susan's inviting us to think about accountability, right? She's asking us to think about it existing in a system. I just want to be clear, restorative justice does exist in system. So this is not just a sort of theoretical abstract inquiry that we're having here today. Whether it's the work that I do or Logan does or others, like there are more than 300 ways in which we've codified restorative justice into criminal law, into education law, into child welfare law, right? And then even beyond that, into tribal law. You can do a quick Google search. There is a restorative justice legislative database. You can sort by functions and features. You can see that the National District Attorneys Association, right, has created a whole map of prosecutorial run restorative justice programs. So I don't think that we need to be sitting in a place where we're sort of wishing for this new utopia that's restorative, right? And I say that both in a sort of critiquing way, but also in a pragmatic way, right? Is to say, okay, so if we know that theory has met practice, right? Not just might it meet practice, then where do we go from here, right? And I think that's where we have some both opportunities and challenges. Because, Susan raises for us the point of constitutional protections. Yes, we are incredibly deficient in terms of our legislation in protecting confidentiality, right? The most significant way in which protect confidentiality for individuals who take accountability, who engage in a restorative process, is through memorandums of understanding, right? There are only 14 states that have ultimately passed confidentiality laws relative to restorative justice in the criminal context, and not all of them are good, right? I'm going to use that true normative word, right? Not all actually provide the protections that we want to have. Right? We also have questions about how and where, coming back to our opening comments, those that experience the harm can actually be engaged in the process. Our laws are not doing a good job about that. Now, that's not to say that the practices on the ground aren't necessarily engaging that way, but there are structural limitations that are being placed on those. Eligibility criterion exists for the ability to even have a case referred to you if you're doing this work on the ground. And we'll hear from practitioners in the afternoon sessions, right? I'm still in California time. I'm like morning sessions. In the afternoon sessions that we'll talk about, right? Eligibility criterion. There are categorical exclusions for the types of crimes, right? What is the continuum in which restorative practices might be, not mandatorily, permissively available across the country, all the way from pre-arrest, right? So Colorado has codified the opportunity for police officers to make on a discretionary level a decision to refer to restorative justice in a pre-arrest moment, all the way to community reentry. So we have an infrastructure, we have an architecture, but, right, if we're going to reimagine, we need to do a better job with it. Right? We need to look at those places and not critique because we think it's imperfect relative to our current system, but ask how and where do we reinforce the architecture that perhaps is shaky? How do we acknowledge that that architecture is reinforcing structural discrimination and structural violence, right? Because perhaps you can't become eligible because of the ways in which you show up. Right? Your socioeconomic status, assumptions about your race, your gender, your sexual identity. And you no longer then, right, because bias creeps in, implicit or explicit, you no longer then have the opportunity to have access to restorative justice. The data bears this out, right? This isn't just sort of me as a professor standing up here being like, oh, folks of color aren't getting access to RJ. Folks of color aren't getting access to RJ, right? And please do look at what we see in terms of programmatic referrals. Now that's not across the board. So that's the places where I think that if we're going to talk about harm reduction, right, that moment of like the urgency of legal practice when your client picks up a case, you're like, oh yeah, I'm going to lean into RJ. But you might also still be thinking in the back of your mind, maybe this is a little bit where you're leaning, Liza, I don't know, I don't want to put too much in your mouth. You're also thinking abolition, right? That's a continuum. That's a reimagining. And that's what RJ invites us to do. But we have something we can already work with. So we shouldn't just assume this is all grasping at straws. Now, of course, that's at the subnational, at the state level, right? The states have been our places of experimentation. Nebraska is close, right behind Colorado in the number of laws that it's codified. You probably didn't know that. Logan knows that, right? You probably didn't know that. So it's not just our places on the coast, right? It's not just our Californias, right? So there's a lot of opportunity, even in the absence of that legislative architecture, because we know that law is not self-executing, nor is it always benevolent and good. But we have places where we all could be leaning into and working, and that's what's dynamic, right? That's what's exciting when we start to have these different conversations from theory to practice in a really tangible and granular way. Thanks, my friend.
Well done.
Thank you. I hear the reminder or the observation that if you think there's something deeply wrong here, you're not alone. If you think things could be different, there are people who've also thought that before you and have done at least some work. And I very much appreciate that message. So,
sure. I'm gonna make sure my mic is working. I saw a chat box pop up earlier. There's some sound issues, it looked like, with the Zoom. So my apologies if that was experienced earlier for anyone. So I'm gonna go a couple different directions in this. And first, while we live in a very dynamic landscape of individuals, of the ways in which things have become politicized, the ways in which, again, we feel this disconnect or partisan nature, or the ways in which we can't see each other, right? Or see each other for who we are and understand one another, right? Where everyone, and when I think about restorative justice, I think about that everyone has the deep desire to be seen, heard, acknowledged, and understood. There's no one in here that doesn't want that for themselves, right? And we should also want that for one another. Touching on the political space, and Logan, again, I appreciate you speaking to this element of like looking at what our interests and values. And I've worked with, again, elected individuals all along the spectrum, right? In various spaces. And again, one of the best things that I've ever heard came from a conservative elective individual who said, Jonathan, after talking about this, after going through these materials, after being in deep conversation and understanding crime victims, he said to me, he's like, this is not a right and left issue. This is a right and wrong issue. This is a sense of how do we do right by the people we're here to serve, by the people that we're here to represent as lawyers, by the people that we are supposed to be uplifting, right? When we think about what our roles are, both as leaders, as lawyers, as individuals with connection to political systems, that there are so many ways in which we become dynamic, right? In the ways that we interact with one another and the ways in which our systems themselves often fall short in what we're hoping to accomplish. I can't help but think of a story of a case that I had a few years ago where we did a restorative justice dialogue while in a homicide by intoxicated use case, where for 2 years, the court, due to their sort of, again, the no contact provision between sort of the responsible party and the family and the victim, this isolation and the separation between families that knew one another with individuals who were friends, and that our system said no. The way that they say we are going to structure the rule of law over any human relationship, and how angry the people were that I worked with for having been forced into separation, where I started with one restorative process with the parents of the individual along with the responsible party, and then a second process between the families, right? To recognize that all of this informs what we think in our legal systems. And so being given that opportunity to work in a concurrent process, right, while a case is still operating, this is a way in which restorative justice supplemented our ongoing, our traditional systems that we have in place, but also requires courage from your prosecutors, from your defense attorneys, from the individuals involved as state actors to provide something different, to provide an opportunity or pathway to healing in that way. And so I've had the great fortune to be involved not only in the deep harm work that I do, but also in the opportunity to help design systems, to design and work in diversion-based programs, to help sort of set up, design, and implement a community restorative court, to continue working in this community court space that ultimately, yes, I think does have to bridge this gap of continuum that says these are the systems that we have right now. We need to vision and envision forward, but we're also going to operate in reality. And the reality is that the systems are here, and tomorrow they're still going to be here. And so we need to work on change in those spaces to introduce the different types of processes of what is possible. And once we continue to see the successes that build, will jurisdictions themselves start to say, this is really working. This is expanding, and this is really effective. And so building on those relationships, again, the human piece, right, between your programs and your district attorney's offices, your defense bar, your judiciary, to see what is possible, right, allows for continual growth and evolution. There's people in this room that I see that I've sort of worked with or consulted with on developing programs, on implementing and building those programs that never existed. That the landscape that we have now looks so vastly different than what it looked like 10 years ago for the opportunities that people have, the space from juvenile through adult, from both lower level to the highest order of crimes can be handled in restorative spaces. And so I'm going to, again, just sort of end there as we sort of move forward.
Thank you. There I heard expansion on the theme that folks who work in these spaces are challenged to both participate in the processes as they are, but not to naturalize them, not to take them as given. And I hear that as very much part of the messiness, the dynamism, the need to be both in the systemic processes and see them critically and reimagine them all together. And I hear, Jonathan, what you said, that you have an approach that meets those challenges, and I think it's quite inspiring. Okay, Logan, it falls to you to bring us home on this set of exchanges.
Well, I'll do my best. Yeah, I just need to say I'm so glad that Susan started us out here talking about personal accountability, because that was really the key for me to not only understand restorative justice, but also to understand our current justice system. It wasn't until I started learning about RJ that I fully understand the extent to which the current system disincentivizes taking responsibility for yourself. You're all many law students here, so you kind of know how it works. You've got, the state on one side, defense on the other, face off before a judge, decide on a winner and a loser or a jury. That's a winner take all system. It's a zero-sum incentive structure, right? And essentially, we've created a system that punishes people for being completely open and honest about what happened. It's quite crazy if you think about it. I was in a circle recently, and a young man put it to me this way. He told me until RJ, he had never been able to express any remorse or regret or take accountability without there being, highly consequential legal consequences, essentially, or being highly consequential from a legal perspective. Just think about that for a second. We've set up a system that basically is doing the opposite of what we want. Psychology tells us that taking responsibility for yourself is a key step in any kind of growth or rehabilitation process. But instead, we've got a system currently that blocks that healing from occurring. The courtroom, I think, puts people in a kind of a defensive crouch, right? They're called defendants for a reason, and I think it's hard to really grow or change when you're in defense mode. So sometimes I say that discovering RJ was kind of like discovering like a new pair of glasses that like allowed me to really see the current system for the first time. And so in addition to the accountability piece, I just like to add limited government as well. I think this is something that everyone can get behind. You know, I think the justice system is really, it represents big government at its worst. You know, prisons, cops, courts. You know, that's a failure, right? In contrast, restorative justice really minimizes the role of the state in people's lives, which is, I think, one of the things that I often can connect with Republican or conservative lawmakers about. So I would just like to add that piece to it. But thank you so much, Susan, for starting us out on that personal accountability piece.
So I want to pick up on and connect with the earlier comment, your shout out to abolitionism, Logan. I am glad that it's come up twice on the panel because it does, I think it is clearly an important set of ideas that is adjacent to RJ, and also just to comment on the remorse piece, that I actually have a well-developed discourse of remorse with the courts in which I practice, because let me tell you, I write beautiful sentencing letters. You're all supposed to laugh now, okay? That was an ironic comment, right? And just really to say how on target I think the observation, right, that the roles as we currently conceive them, right, put the people who have the most at stake farthest from the system, right, and encourage the professionals to adopt this professionalized discourse that works very well in our roles and systems, but doesn't really speak to what's going on here. We have, we're not done yet. We have a little bit of time, but I want to encourage people to think about questions they have for this terrific panel, because we're going to turn to the questions in just a minute. But I want to give each of you a chance for a last lightning round comment. The question I want to put to you is, since we have the opportunity to start this off, is there something you want to encourage all the participants to keep an eye out for, to think about, to look for during the day? And I'm particularly wondering if anybody wants to make any comments about self-care in a day like today, because as we've already seen, each of us comes to these issues and to this work for our own reasons and with our own experiences. Certainly not everyone, but you see where I'm going on this. So any thoughts on that? And then we'll take some questions.
You can't yoga your way out of feeling stressed out, but you can try, or at least that's what I do every day. So so self-care, right? I say this to my students. I say this to my 8-year-old daughter. I, could say this to the person on the street, though I don't typically, which is you just need to find what works for you, right? So whatever that somatic, right? Whatever that interpersonal moment is and which carries you through the work, like that's what you should do, right? So today, if that means taking a break, if that means checking your phone, because like that's actually really important to you. If that means FaceTiming with your kid and everybody's hearing her yell meme at you because that's her nickname, maybe you do that. I'm speaking specifically for myself. So to the extent, right, especially in this moment, I also would say that self-care is about making a set of really deliberate determinations about where you're going to invest your energies. You can't invest in everything, and that's okay. And that doesn't make you a bad person. That doesn't mean you don't care. That doesn't mean you're not in the movement, in the work, and in solidarity with people. It means that you're human and that you find the people that support you to do that. My pivot to what would be my 3 takeaways that rotate around one thing. It picks back up where Logan left us, which is to say, RJ only minimizes the role of the state when the state doesn't control restorative justice. So there's a really important aspect that we might want to think about, especially as we sit in the halls of legal institutions and that many of us walk in those halls. Second, state sanctioning doesn't validate restorative justice, right? So sort of a joinder to that. That means that I would sit with Jonathan in the power over power with and add, let's decouple that from state power. And then lastly, where does that land us? That we must invest in community restorative justice. Let's invest in the people and the places that know how to do this work, right? Maybe this is to come back to Professor Bader's invocation of an indigenous epistemology, restorative justice, but maybe it's just coming back to a sensibility that those that are experiencing and have experienced intergenerational harm and trauma know how to care for themselves and others. And that's what community justice, right? And support, back to where you also asked what self-care lives. So that's what I would rotate around.
I'm going to take a piece where it says, what to be on the lookout for? Well, I want to say again, as we continue to move forward, and we think about where do our systems go, where does our legal system go? The first thing I want to say is be on the lookout and be aware of how crime victims are used. They're very often trotted out for support of legislation that may not actually serve them a great deal. Like, they're used when they're convenient and set aside when they are not. Right. And that means the same thing in our systems, in our criminal legal system, right? When a crime victim doesn't want what the state wants, they're no longer part of the justice process, right? And are frozen out. And I've heard this time and time again. So again, be aware and be on the lookout, right? As we move forward in a legal and legislative landscape, if we are transitioning sort of back to the 90s, right, in this space of sort of tough on crime, rather than thinking about what makes sense, that there likely will be manipulation that occurs, and that also think about from the space of crime victims. On the space around sort of self-care, I would say again is this idea of recognizing who we are. Recognize who yourself is as a person and what you need. Try to align your professional identity as closely as possible to your personal identity to the degree that it is safe, recognizing that that is not true in all spaces, and taking time to care for and connect with one another so that we're not just speaking about self-care, but also of community care, and that we care for one another. Find your small community in this moment. Find those people that you can provide care and support to and lean into that.
Thanks
and
so
through
much.
that strength, we will continue to move forward in the way that will help heal us all.
Thanks so much. Logan, I feel I should turn to you next. I actually understand that the last shall be first, but in this case, it's third. But that's what we can do.
Sure. Yeah. I just wrapping up. I commend everyone here for just coming here today and attending, and really commend Fordham for taking on restorative justice as a topic, because in some sense it's sort of threatening to the legal profession. If there's lawyers involved in restorative justice, but if it was more ubiquitous, there might be a need for less lawyers out there, and that can be threatening to people. I go around the country and I talk to conservatives about these issues, but some of the most pushback I get is not from Republicans necessarily. It's from people with a vested interest in the status quo. It's people who are being served by the current system. We're talking prosecutors, judges, corrections folks, but even like victim services people and mental health providers they're all part of like what I like to call the criminal justice industrial complex. And the fact is that restorative justice is a threat to that. I love that Upton Sinclair quote. For these people, I'll get it because I want to get it right. You helped me out the other day with it. It's difficult to get a person to understand something when their salary depends on them not understanding it. And I think that really applies to a lot of people in the legal profession. So thank you all for coming out today, and really keep at it, because RJ is really cool, and so keep studying. And
First and last word.
Okay, so I'll just try to say quickly, I of course think self-care is really important, and being trauma informed, both for our clients and ourselves, is really important. But I also want to say that at the same time, restorative justice in a way can be self-care, that what we're talking about is for me as a public defender, I experienced a lot of trauma because there was no space to be human with my client or in that system or in that courtroom. But actually the idea of conflict, we're so used to thinking of as scary and hard and bad, but actually something that gives us an opportunity to come together and heal can actually, for me, I feel like it's less trauma inducing than the practice of law in a lot of ways. And so I just want to say that thinking about restorative justice as always being really painful, which it can be, but it's really being human. It's all of those feelings. And when they get listened to and when they get expressed, it can be so healing that it is a kind of self-care as well. In my experience. And then just one other really quick thing I want to say is that our system does afford a lot of opportunities for restorative justice, and I appreciate that, all the reminders of everything that's going on. But sometimes trying to fit it into a system that reduces things to concepts to their very simplest, people are angry, they want jail. Well, people might want that right after some violent thing, and then 6 months later, they might want something really different, and a year later, and then 5 years later, and that the system doesn't allow for that kind of growth and change. And you can do restorative justice at any point, and people, as we know, do in prison or wherever it serves them, and it doesn't always fit into what the system has set up as possible. So
Thanks so
I just
much.
wanted to mention that.
Thanks so much. Let's turn to questions. We have a mic going around, so here comes the mic. Okay.
Yes, I want to possibly bring up where a situation where somewhat restorative justice is involved, trauma-informed restorative justice is informed, and it's a fairly low level, not criminal level. My daughter has been a college administrator for several years. One of her duties is to do preliminary investigations in Title IX. And every once in a while, she asks me questions. And what I've discovered is that it almost turns the adversarial system on its head. The accuser is called the victim from the get-go. Sometimes the people that do investigations also are the ones that will do the administrative determination. And I'm involved in administrative law, but the principles or the measures that are applied are almost absurd. There's no, and sometimes there's no. I'm sorry, there's no cross-examination, for example, in many instances. The standard is substantial law rather than preponderance of the evidence. And there have been some cases that have had a lot of notoriety. Duke University lacrosse team, the Columbia University student. And again, what I see is, and in many instances, the situation is that could be consensual sex, but and alcohol is invariably involved. And the next morning, the victim, again, that's
I'm going to say
the victim.
I'm going to say
The victim.
if you want to pose a question for us, I'm just concerned about time.
I've looked for law review articles to give to her. The one that's really comprehensive wasn't even written by a lawyer. It was published in, I believe, at NYU Law Review by a historian at Brooklyn College. Again, I throw this out.
Feel free to send me a note. I know a number of people that work in the Title IX space, as did Jonathan, in particular, doing work around sexual harm and sexual violence and restorative justice. There are like specialized folks. There's probably more than a dozen, if not at this point, 24 law review articles. And I think we're both happy to
understand.
discourse.
But the point or the question I make is that this concept, at least in this instance, it's probably distorting what the process should be. So is there any danger that incorporating restorative justice, at least at the preliminary level, it doesn't introduce distortions into the process itself, in the judicial process, in the hearing and judicial or administrative law ruling. Again, it's at a lower level, not at the level that the panel is treated. And that's the point I want addressed.
Sure. So, no. Okay. I think, again, very happy to talk to some of this. Obviously, there's not enough time to discuss all the nuance in this space, but it is an incredible area of growth. There are multiple flexible ways in which you can design process that take into account both the FERPA considerations as well as obviously due process rights, and thinking about the interplay between prosecutors' offices and looking at those cases and how they get resolved on a campus versus how they get resolved at, again, the criminal level. But that sense of, like, do they automatically distort? No. The answer is that the structure and the way that it is designed and created can build in the necessary protections that are there that fit within sort of existing structures to serve as an adjacent process that can allow these sorts of harms and again, allegations to be resolved, right? But again, I would need another 20 to 25 minutes to sort of walk through those.
I'm afraid it's going to mean we won't hear other questioners. Let's go to other questions, please.
But again, there are these distortions and these problems that are already cropping up.
Okay.
Do we have another question? Thank you. It's a difficult area.
Oh.
So you're cutting us off. All right.
Thank you, everyone.